Hey everyone, welcome to our deep dive into why Belarus depends on 10 key countries to keep its economy running. Without these nations, Belarus could face serious trouble, maybe even collapse. Stick around till the end to understand why these countries are so important. If you find this helpful, hit that like button, subscribe, and watch till the end for a quick wrap-up. Let's get started. Number 10. Turkey. Turkey imports $700 million in Belarusian wood and textiles in 2023, growing in 2025 as EU trade shrinks. Without Turkey, Belarus would lose 4% of exports, hitting 7,000 jobs in small businesses and factories. Turkey supplies affordable goods, keeping inflation 8% in 2025 stable. Losing this would raise prices by 10%, hurting households. Turkey's role as a non-sanctioning partner supports 5% of trade. Without it, GDP would drop by 3%, and the trade deficit would worsen. Belarus's economy would struggle to replace Turkey's market and goods, risking collapse as costs rise and reserves shrink. Turkey's growing trade role is vital for stability. Number 9. Netherlands. The Netherlands imported $1 billion in Belarusian oil products in 2021 via Rotterdam. In 2025, sanctions cut this, but it's still 4% of exports, $350 million. Without the Netherlands, Belarus would lose 6% of revenue, impacting refineries with 10,000 jobs. Russian ports raise costs by 20%. The Netherlands supplied chemicals for 8% of industries. Losing these would cut output by 8%, raising prices. GDP would shrink by 4%, and the trade deficit would grow. Foreign reserves would drop, and inflation, 8% in 2025, would spike. Belarus's economy, reliant on oil exports for 15% of revenue, would struggle to replace this market, risking collapse as refineries stall and jobs vanish. Number 8. India. India imports $800 million in Belarusian fertilizers and chemicals in 2023, a key market in 2025 as EU trade falls. Without India, Belarus would lose 5% of exports, impacting 8,000 factory jobs. India supplies raw materials for 15% of industries, worth $300 million. Losing these would raise costs by 12%, halting production. The trade deficit would grow, draining $8 billion in reserves. India's demand for fertilizers supports 10% of Belarus's export revenue. Without it, GDP would drop by 3%, and inflation would worsen. Belarus's economy, limited by sanctions, would struggle to find new markets, risking collapse. India's role as a stable, non-sanctioning partner is vital for economic stability and preventing a deeper crisis. Number 7. Brazil. Brazil imports 3.5 million tons of Belarusian potash yearly, worth $1.2 billion in 2025, vital as EU markets shrink. Without Brazil, Belarus would lose 7% of export revenue, hitting factories with 12,000 jobs. Sanctions limit new buyers, making Brazil's market critical. Brazil supplies agricultural materials for 10% of Belarus's farming, worth $200 million. Losing this would raise costs by 15%, cutting food production. GDP would drop by 4%, and inflation, 8% in 2025, would spike. Foreign reserves would dwindle, weakening the ruble. Belarus's economy, reliant on fertilizers for 20% of exports, would struggle to replace Brazil, deepening dependence on Russia. This would risk collapse as factories close and prices soar, affecting households. Number 6. Lithuania. Lithuania's Klaipėda port handled $2.7 billion in Belarusian potash exports in 2021. A 2023 ban cut this, but some trade persists via Russia. Without Lithuania, Belarus would lose 60% of fertilizer revenue, a 9% GDP hit. Potash employs 15,000 workers, and losing this market would cause layoffs. Russian ports raise costs by 20%, cutting profits. Lithuania supplied tech and materials before sanctions, supporting 10% of industries. Without these, output would drop 10%, and inflation would rise. The $2 billion trade deficit would grow, draining reserves. Belarus's economy, reliant on potash for 20% of exports, would face a crisis without Lithuania's trade routes. Jobs in mining and transport would vanish, and replacing this market is nearly impossible under sanctions, pushing Belarus toward collapse. Number 5. Germany. Germany imported $1 billion in Belarusian wood and chemicals in 2021, now reduced by sanctions but still 3% of exports in 2025, $300 million. Without Germany, Belarus would lose a high-value EU market, cutting revenue by 8%. German machinery supports 25% of industrial output, employing 30,000 workers. Losing these imports would halt factories, as Belarus can't produce such equipment. This would cause 10,000 job losses and a 4% GDP drop. Germany's role as an EU trade hub helps Belarus access other markets indirectly, worth 5% of exports. Without it, costs would rise by 15%, worsening the $2 billion trade deficit. Foreign reserves would shrink, and inflation, 8% in 2025, would spike. Belarus's economy, reliant on state-owned factories, would struggle to replace Germany's technology and market, risking collapse as industries fail and unemployment rises. Number 4. Poland. Poland was a major trade partner before sanctions, with $1.5 billion in exports in 2021, mainly chemicals and machinery. In 2025, trade is down but supports 5% of exports, worth $400 million. Poland's Dansk port handled $1 billion in goods before 2022. Without Poland, Belarus would use Russian ports, increasing costs by 25%. This would cut export revenue by 10%, impacting factories with 20% of Belarus's workforce. Sanctions already slashed trade by 70%, and losing Poland would shrink GDP by 4%. Poland supplies raw materials for 10% of industries. Without these, production would stall, causing 8,000 job losses and a 15% price hike. Belarus's trade deficit would grow, straining $8 billion in reserves. Replacing Poland's market is tough due to sanctions, risking economic instability. Poland's role as a pre-sanctioned EU trade hub was vital, and its loss would push Belarus toward collapse. Number 3. Ukraine. Before 2022, Ukraine bought $2 billion in Belarusian fertilizers and machinery yearly. In 2025, despite war-related trade drops, Ukraine is vital for trade routes and food exports, supporting 15% of Belarus's GDP. Belarus sends 20% of its agricultural exports to Ukraine, worth $500 million in 2023. Without Ukraine, Belarus would rely on costlier Russian routes, raising shipping costs by 30%. This would cut GDP by 5% and hurt farmers and factories. The ruble would weaken, reducing foreign currency earnings. Sanctions limit EU markets, making Ukraine's role as a nearby trade partner critical. Losing it would disrupt raw material supplies, impacting 10% of industrial output and 12,000 jobs. Belarus's economy would face higher costs and fewer markets, risking a 7% export revenue drop. Without Ukraine, Belarus would struggle to maintain trade balance, pushing it closer to collapse as inflation rises and reserves dwindle. Number 2. China. China is Belarus's second-largest trade partner, with $3.7 billion in trade in 2023, expected to reach $4 billion in 2025. Belarus imports $2.7 billion in electronics and machinery, critical for factories producing 20% of GDP. Western sanctions since 2020 make China a key supplier, as EU and US markets are restricted. China's $1 billion investment in the Great Stone Industrial Park supports 10,000 jobs and tech growth. Without China, Belarus would face a 20% rise in production costs, cutting GDP by 6%. The trade deficit, $2 billion in 2023, would grow, draining $8 billion in reserves. China buys 5% of Belarus's fertilizers, a vital export. Losing this market would cut export revenue by 10%, hitting 15,000 factory jobs. Belarus's economy would struggle to replace China's affordable goods and investments, stalling modernization. Inflation would rise, and businesses would close, pushing Belarus toward economic collapse. China's role as a non-sanctioning partner is crucial for stability. Number 1. Russia. Russia is Belarus's biggest supporter, controlling 70% of its exports, worth $28 billion in 2023, projected to hit $30 billion in 2025. It supplies 99% of Belarus's natural gas, 20 billion cubic meters yearly, saving $5 billion annually, or 15% of Belarus's $70 billion GDP. Russia's loans and port access for potash and oil exports are vital, supporting industries employing 30% of workers. Without Russia, Belarus would lose most trade revenue, face energy shortages, and see factories close. Inflation at 6.9% in 2025 would soar, and the Belarusian ruble would crash, making goods unaffordable. Russia buys 40% of Belarus's agricultural and machinery exports, driving 25% of GDP. Losing this would devastate jobs, with 500,000 workers at risk. Energy prices would spike, hitting households and businesses. Belarus's economy, heavily state-controlled, lacks the flexibility to adapt without Russia's subsidies and markets, risking a 50% GDP drop and collapse. Thanks for watching. Belarus's economy leans heavily on these 10 countries for trade, energy, and survival. Without them, it's game over. If you learned something new, smash that like button, subscribe for more, and share your thoughts below. See you next time.